It is a new day here at Fingerprints Workshop. It's actually a new week. The car is a little different than how it was when we left off in the last episode. Previously, we had picked up the car after sitting for 20 years, got it cleaned up a bit, freed up some seized rotors, and installed some new tires. One of the few differences from then is that it now has a battery, so we can test what electronics do and do not work. The first thing that came on was this little trunk light, but everyone knows that when a Fiero's trunk light comes on, it also means the trunk lock disappears and destroys some of the fiberglass body around it. Or maybe that's just my case. The issue is because of this little trunk light switch, but mainly because of my own stupidity. The switch was actually unplugged when we got it, and that's probably because it wasn't getting pressed down all the way, and therefore the light wasn't turning off, like you can see here. So after a bit of searching, it looks like the hinge attachment was the culprit, because there's a gap here, but not on the passenger side. The body lines are flush on this side when the trunk is closed, but not over on the side with the gap. So after a bit of adjusting, it's better, but still not quite perfect. So it was adjusted a little more off camera, as well as closing the lid with the keys inside the trunk. I wish I was joking. The lock had to be drilled out, because not only was that the only set of keys I had, there was also no trunk release inside the car. That wouldn't have been too bad, except for the fact that the whole assembly twisted once it was loose and destroyed some of the fiberglass body around it. The good news is that I have been working with fiberglass since I was 12 years old, so it's not really going to be too hard to fix, but it's still really annoying that it happened in the first place when it could have been easily avoided. Well, you live and you learn. Hey, it's been a few days, let's replace that lock. So here is the lock that I drilled out, and I'm going to replace it with this one right here that I got online. And it should just be a direct replacement. So let's go ahead and do that. Hey! The trunk was now closing, locking, and light turning offing, so now we're back to where we were before this whole fiasco happened. The battery's in, the trunk light works, let's go see the inside. The dome lights and footwell lights work as well, but most importantly, the radio works along with the headrest speakers. This was the first and I think the only production car to have headrest speakers from the factory, so that's pretty cool. And a fire hazard. The HVAC system seems to be unresponsive. The blower motor didn't turn on, and I also didn't hear the servo motor move that controls which vents the air is blowing from. The horn works sometimes, and the windows barely. With the parking light switched on, some lights work. One running light is out on the passenger side, and only this one side marker is on. The front running lights do work, but the headlights are a different story. With the switch hit, they're on, but not popping up. The motors are spinning, as you can see here, but nothing is happening. That will be fixed later, but for now, let's look into getting this car closer to starting. Okay, so the battery is in, and we know some of the electronics work, but now we're going to see if the engine can turn over with the starter motor. I did already try it off camera, doing it by hand with a ratchet, and it does turn over. But before I just went and tried that, I took out the spark plugs and filled each of these cylinders with penetrating fluid, let that sit for a few days, then I went to turn it over. So I didn't want to cause any damage to the cylinders or the rings. So I do know that I can turn over freely by hand. Now I'm going to see with the starter motor.
That is not a good sound.
That didn't sound good. The starter motor itself seems to be working perfectly fine, but it's not engaging with the flywheel, so it isn't turning the engine at all. But instead of dealing with that now, we'll fix some other things. We have a bunch of parts, mainly from Rock Auto, and we're going to start with these spark plugs. This is a super simple task that anyone can do. It's great for dipping your toes into the world of working on cars. The air intake did have to be unbolted and moved to the side to gain access to some of the spark plugs, but it was easy from there on out. Some spark plugs did break when unbolting them, but that is pretty common, especially with plugs that are 20 years old. And like I previously said, we took the plugs out and added plenty of penetrating fluid inside the cylinders off camera and before we even tried starting the car. I really can't stress how important that is. It isn't necessary for a typical plug replacement, but since the car was sitting for so long, we wanted to make sure that the pistons would be sliding smoothly once the engine was turned over for the first time. People also use automatic transmission fluid or just regular oil. Whatever you choose will probably be just fine. All that really matters is that there's plenty of lubrication. But once the plugs were snugged up, we could start with the ignition wires. This is really easy. They just pop off and snap in with a firm press. The only thing to be careful of is to make sure they're all going to the correct cylinder, so it's best to do one at a time. And after that, we got to replacing the worn out vacuum lines that I pointed out in the last episode. These hoses can be purchased in bulk online for relatively cheap, but you can also get them locally at any auto parts supplier, which in our case was AutoZone.
Alright, so we replaced these vacuum lines, this vacuum line, and this vacuum line here. We didn't replace the specialty vacuum lines on the throttle body or on the intake because they were in good enough condition and we didn't think we needed to replace them.
So assuming the ignition coil and distributor are good, we should have air and spark covered. Now we just need fuel. When the key is turned, the fuel pump relay clicks on and off for priming the system, which is great that that works, but the fuel pump itself isn't turning on. The motor should be super audible, yet there is nothing but silence. So that means we are dropping the tank. With the battery unplugged, we can lift the car up, which involves a lot less jacking this time. We gave the ground under the car a good cleaning since it had a date with our backs for the next hour or so. The tank is held up with 2 straps. And lastly, a support plate in the middle with 4 bolts. There's also the wiring for the pump and fuel level sender, as well as 3 rubber lines. Those lines were actually the toughest thing about dropping the tank.
Ooh, it burns.
What we ended up having to do was take the 2 lines off that we could, drop the whole tank down, then remove the remaining line.
Go.
We had also already unplugged the electrical connector up in the engine bay, so we were able to pull the wires down and slide the whole tank out.
That is very small.
Yes, it is.
$20 worth of gasoline.
The assembly was gross. The 20-year-old gasoline had turned to varnish and completely ruined everything. The level sender mechanism was rusted through, so that's definitely not going to work anymore. But after giving the assembly a light scrub with a wire brush to make it more tolerable to handle, we brought it over to the engine bay to do some testing. Okay, so we took off the fuel sending unit, this right here, out of the gas tank, and we temporarily wired up the new fuel pump to the unit, and we're going to turn the key and see if this works. So let's do that right now. Yes! It works! That's fantastic. This is a good sign that no gremlins took shelter in this car, but there still leaves the issue of the gas tank. There is a very decent amount of rust on the inside, not to mention the varnish, so we can't just throw everything back in the car right now. We brought the tank outside and dumped the contents into a bucket. I should also note that it would have been very wise to wear a respirator here, so if you ever have to deal with varnish or any other harmful chemical, be sure that you are better than us. Please wear your PPE. With that said, we continued working, and after dumping out all that we could, we put the pump assembly back on, put the gas tank upright, and filled the entire thing with vinegar. Since vinegar is mainly acetic acid, it works really well to get rid of all the rust. And get rid of all the rust it did. So much so that after 48 hours, it ate through what was left of the metal at the bottom. Once it was empty, I could start the repair. What I'm using is a product called Steel Stick from JB Weld. It's essentially plumber's epoxy, but it does say that it can be used for fuel tanks on the packaging. The repair method I chose isn't the best way to go about this, I do understand that, but it's good enough to last a short while, just to bring this car back to life. Chemical dipping the whole tank and welding or brazing the hole shut would be the best solution, but that's not in the budget, and neither is buying a non-rusty second-hand tank. There's no reproduction tanks made for these cars, and used ones go for hundreds of dollars, so this is good with me, at least for now. So after cleaning the surface, sanding the metal down, cleaning it once more with degreaser, the putty was mixed up and applied, as you saw.
So the steel stick is on there right now and curing, and that'll take about an hour before it is fully cured. So I'm gonna wait probably an hour and a half just to be safe before I add the vinegar in again. And I checked all over and there's no more pinholes anywhere else. So this should be it. And then from here, we can go on to clean the gas tank fully. Did I say that I checked for more pinholes? Because I did. I just didn't find them apparently.
There was a lot more pinholes that showed up. But as tedious as this was to take care of, it's good that they're all showing up now so that they can be addressed. The same thing was done as last time. Clean, sand, clean again, and apply. So now that those are taken care of, we can finally move on to, oh wait, no, there's more. These were fixed with regular JB Weld. That didn't last, but that will be talked about in part 4 of this series. The repairs held fine for the duration of this episode and the next one. So after emptying out all the vinegar, the shop vac was used to suck up any remaining sediments that failed to find its way out during all the shaking. Diesel fuel was then added inside the tank and sloshed around and then emptied out. This way the diesel evenly coats the inner surface of the tank so it won't flash rust, because it otherwise would in a matter of minutes. This is all very similar to what I already did in the gas tank video for my old ZR7S. So it's not 100%, but it's good enough. That isn't the best attitude to have, I know that, especially since I'm working on a motor vehicle where safety is of the utmost importance, but it is temporary and shouldn't pose any serious problems for the time being. The very last thing to do for the tank was painting it with high heat paint that is also fuel resistant. But it's not entirely necessary to get that kind. Regular undercarriage or engine enamel would have sufficed, but this is pretty cheap. So after doing 2 coats on both sides, it was set in the sun to dry. Now let's go back in time to when the tank was full of vinegar and between pinhole repairs so we can see the state of the oil in the engine.
That's not too bad.
It honestly isn't that bad. It's jet black, yeah, but there doesn't seem to be any coolant or water in here, which is really good news, and it's also not sludgy or chunky. This is far better than what I could have asked for, but I still don't want to take any chances. To make sure everything was cleared out of the engine, I filled the entire thing with diesel fuel. This is apparently an old school trick that was done by lots of mechanics back in the day. The fuel acts as a solvent, breaking down any buildup that might be in there. This was something I learned from the YouTube channel Initial Dave, where he restored a Daihatsu Avanzado that was sitting for 13 years. So while the diesel fuel was doing its thing, I decided to replace the fuel filter. This thing was really stuck on there. The threaded ends came off just fine, but even after the clamp was removed, it did not want to go anywhere.
Oh my god.
The new one went on a lot smoother. So after a few days passed, I went back to drain all of the diesel fuel out. So it was a little darker than it was when it went in, but it seems like there's no buildup inside. The drain plug was screwed back on after letting it drip, and then I added some fresh oil. The oil I used isn't too expensive since another oil change would be done shortly after getting this thing started. One slight oversight by me was that I forgot to put on a new oil filter. Believe it or not, this is actually my first time doing an oil change on a car. I have done it plenty of times for motorcycles, but never a car somehow. But now that that's done, we're back up to the point where we left off with the gas tank.
Some high school kid offered me $1,500 for the bike.
The whole unit was really straightforward to assemble back together. The pump is connected to the hardline just by a short hose. The fuel sock is then just press fit onto the pump, and finally the 2 wires are plugged in with heat shrink going around one of them so no short circuits happen. And after that, it's ready to be installed. So you may also notice that I added some new foam pads around the tank. The original ones were so bad and they just fell off, so I made some new ones out of Craft EVA foam, which also happens to be from the same sheet of foam that I used to make the eyeliners for the Batman and Iron Man helmets. The masking tape I added when I painted this thing was taken off, and then the surface was sanded smooth because a little bit of flash rusting happened on this surface. There was a new rubber seal that was added and the whole assembly was locked in place.
Okay. Alright.
The wire loom was missing a small section of shielding, so I wrapped the whole thing in electrical tape to give it some protection. Lastly, the new fuel lines, which are also from AutoZone, were cut to length next to the originals. There was a little bit of oil that was added to the hard lines, and that helps the rubber lines go on smoothly. And once those clamps are tightened down, the whole thing is ready to be put back in. To make our lives easier, we snaked a plastic tube down the firewall, so pulling up the wires will be not so tedious later on. There were a few cobwebs that needed to be cleaned out, but after that, the tank was ready to go in. You're gonna push.
Okay.
So getting it up was the easy part, but keeping it up was difficult. I guess I'm not as young as I thought I was. The bolt hole for the strap wasn't quite making it to the bolt that was there, and our arms were becoming noodles, so we instated the help of the floor jack, which we should have done right away. Those straps were bolted up as well as the support plate, and then the fuel lines were plumbed back up with the help of some oil just like from earlier. Finally, the wires were snaked back up the firewall with the help of the plastic tube, and the connector was plugged back in.
Okay.
It's together.
Yep. Let's turn that KC to prime. Alright. Yeah.
But before we could see if it would start, we have to address the starter motor issue from earlier. Okay, there's supposed to be 4 bolts holding the starter motor on. 2 from the top right by the gear and 2 on the back holding it in place. There's only 1 bolt, and it's one of the ones holding up the front by the gear. That's weird. The motor was turned so it made contact with the flywheel again, and then the single bolt was tightened back down. So with that done, the very last thing to do is add some gas.
So assuming there is a good distributor, coil, and fuel injector, the car should start right now. So let's find out. I'm gonna go for it.
Give it a crank. Neutral.
It wasn't looking too good. We took the air filter cover off and tried once more. Nothing. There was no fuel. That clearly is a problem, but to ensure that the ignition system is working, we tried spraying in some carb cleaner to see if that would ignite.
That was just the carb cleaner.
But it still ran.
It ran.
Oh boy. Oh boy. Okay.
I got it in there while you had the valve open. So,
I'm gonna do it.
okay. Yeah, so it's not the connector. It went up to 4 volts when you gave it a crank.
So it is getting power. That either means the gas isn't flowing to the injector, or gas is flowing, but the injector itself isn't working. So we took a closer look, and after removing the top plate of the assembly, fuel poured out.
Well, there's definitely fuel getting up there.
So that means the pump is working and the line isn't clogged. So it must be something with the injector then. We took it off and sprayed carb cleaner inside all of the orifices. At the time of filming this, I didn't really know how injectors worked, so I wasn't sure if what we were doing would make a difference, but I thought it'd be worth a shot. I did know that carb cleaner would be harmful to any internal seals, so we did make sure to not let it soak for too long. Also, if you think this injector looks strange, it's because it is. It's one of the very early styles, from around the time when the switch from carburetors to fuel injection was first happening. So once everything was back in place, we gave it another shot. Nothing. Again. Well, not nothing. The injector was slowly dripping out fuel, but not spraying it out at high pressure like it's supposed to. We took it off once more for another carb spray down and gave it one more shot.
Okay, so it runs, but there's no coolant, so let's put that in right now.
To add coolant to the Fiero, the first thing you have to do is take off the front radiator cap, and then take off the rear thermostat housing cap. From there, coolant was added until it overflowed from the front, and then the radiator cap was put back on. More coolant was added back at the back until it reached the top. There is a burping process that involves running the engine with the heater on intermittently and adding more coolant until all the air pockets are gone, but that was done off camera. Some more coolant was added at the reservoir up front, and then the car was started once more. The car was running, but it had a really strange idle, going up and down sporadically. To add to that, the belt driving the water pump and the alternator just broke. The belt was 20 years old, so that's not really a surprise. The new belt was put on by loosening the two alternator bolts and hinging the alternator inward. The belt was then slid over the pulleys and tensioned by pulling the alternator back out. It wasn't until 1987 that the Iron Duke engine got a separate tensioner pulley. But after that was taken care of, I got to fixing the weird idle. After doing a bit of research, it seemed like everything was pointing toward the idle air control valve, so I took that off and gave it a look. The valve had a decent amount of carbon buildup, as well as the housing for it in the throttle body. So I sprayed down the valve with some carb cleaner and lightly brushed it with a nylon brush. The housing for it was sprayed down with carb cleaner off camera, and then the valve was put back in place. The weird idle is now gone, and I could finally say I had a properly running Pontiac Fiero. It is unbelievable to me that the car is alive again after sitting for 20 years, but it is, because of me and my brother. I do know that there's a bunch of videos out there of barn finds starting after sitting for much longer periods of time, but it really felt like we accomplished the impossible. This gave me a huge boost of confidence for the rest of the project. But even though this is a crucial part, we still have a long way to go. So, until next time, I'll see you guys later.